Right, hi everybody. First of all, I apologize for all the noise that's happening outside. If it affects the audio quality in any way, my apologies. Can't really do anything about it. Um, so today we'll be talking a bit about narratives in debating, um, and how you should potentially want to think about tackling narratives motions. These are fairly common in debate tournaments these days. It tends to appear at least once in a tournament. Um, uh, Whether it's ABPs or other majors or even smaller tournaments. So the first thing I want to just quickly situate is what the point of this video is. This is meant to be a quick primer. I'm not gonna go into a 45-minute rant on all the different narratives motions that are out there. And the reason is because I think most people tend to tune out after the first 20 minutes anyway. So I'll try to condense everything into the first 20 minutes and hopefully give you all a brief idea about what strategies you can employ. Especially given that there's only 15 minutes of prep in the BPs, it's generally good to have a grip over the basic handles about how to tackle these motions so that you can go straight into prep and go straight into relevant points or relevant idea generation during your 15 minutes, which is often what the difference between being first or being third or fourth tends to be. I also don't proclaim to be an expert on this topic. I used to be very bad at narratives motions. I could still be very bad at narratives motions. So this is more just a way for me to perhaps show you what a bit of what I've learned over the last couple of years, and maybe these tips will be helpful for you in the future as well. Because I do understand the struggles with these motions sometimes, and hopefully what I say today will be helpful in correcting some of the problems with the way that you guys might prep these motions. Okay, so what are narratives debates first and foremost? The core of a narrative debate is that it asks you as a debater to isolate one specific narrative in society, and to isolate this narrative and discuss what its impacts or influence over broader society or indeed in on an individual actor uh, is or might be. So it could be presently how the narrative acts within society. It could be asking you to extrapolate what the narrative might look like in the future and how it might affect these groups in the future. And it could be talking about broader repercussions towards wider society, or it could be talking about one specific actor or group of actors. So it could be on a country, it could be on like a gender, it could be on a minority in some motions, right? And it basically asks you to try and figure out how these narratives affect those communities. And typically, therefore, just as with most debates, teams must do two things to win. They have to first mechanize how this impact or influence happens, and then they have to explain how the impact or the influence is uniquely valuable. Mechanization and impact, things that you probably already know if you're going for ABP. But I think what happens a lot in these debates is that teams do that mechanization, teams do that impacting, and then they get out strategized, or their mechanization or their impacts sort of get filtered out or sort of like rebutted out of the debate in a way, and you're sort of left wondering, why did I take that third and fourth when I sort of did all the steps during prep to make sure that this wouldn't happen. And what I want to try and do is delve deeper into these two win conditions, and how they apply specifically in narratives motion, and therefore how you might be able to think more comprehensively about these two pillars during prep. So let's start with mechanization, right? And I think one of the core questions you might want to ask yourself during prep is what the narrative's mode of transmission is and why. So narratives are transmitted in many different ways. Some are transmitted through the media, through popular media, right, like TV, films, games. Others could be more culturally transmitted, either through media as well, or through word of mouth, through family traditions, through traditions of your community, perhaps, right? And I think how a narrative comes to be and how a narrative becomes prevalent in the mindset of an individual is often based on how it is transmitted as well. Right? So a narrative that is more popular, that is transmitted through mainstream media, might take root more amongst young people, right, who follow social media, who are more concerned about things like entertainment, whereas more deep-seated beliefs might or more familiar beliefs that have less of an audience might come from these sort of culturally transmitted spaces, and these narratives might be more difficult to break out of because you're being taught perhaps by your family or by your parents that doing things a certain way is the right way. You might have a lot of guilt associated with not following what your parents want you to do, for instance, and therefore even so perhaps unlike mainstream media that is more broadly transmitted, um, a culturally transmitted narrative could be lesser in terms of its scope, right, and its scale, but it could be much harder to break out of, right, for an individual. So in this instance, I think one thing you want to think about is this like famous saying, the medium is the message, right? Often the modes of transmission um, impact the effects of a particular narrative. It impacts how susceptible people are to these narratives. It impacts how easy it is for people to uh, reject those narratives. Um, and sometimes it also impacts the ways in which these narratives evolve, right, or shape itself differently across time, right? Because some narratives are one way, but some narratives are two ways. It's a kind of communication between two parties. And there might be ways to push back against a narrative or to nuance a narrative if you have some degree of influence over the way that the narrative is transmitted. So these are all things that might affect, right, the way in which a narrative um, acts upon individuals, and consequently how might be able to mechanize um, these how these narratives operate. But also, I think a lot of motions tend to ask you to project the hypothetical where these narratives have spread particularly far. So often you have motions like this house supports the dominant narrative or the narrative being dominant, right? And in these instances, there's probably a burden on the government side to talk about this narrative being something that supersedes or overwhelms other narratives within society. But there are other kinds of motions as well. Motions that just ask you to support the narrative, right? Motions that talk about the rise of a particular narrative. So the rise being perhaps an increase in popularity of the narrative, right? And all these are things to think about during prep, right? Is there a way for me to say that the narrative is perhaps not so bad, but it is the rise of the narrative that might shape the narrative differently, or that the narrative is not so bad when it's isolated towards a few people, but when it spreads across society and becomes a superseding narrative, that's when it becomes a problem. So you might be able to, as opposition, for example, exploit these, burdens, right, that are imposed on the government team in the motion. Not all narratives apply to every single individual as well. Some narratives are more prevalent amongst women, for example, or minorities. So knowing who a narrative is more likely to affect and who is able to have the privilege to reject certain narratives, or to just ignore certain narratives, perhaps, could also be useful. So if narratives disproportionately hurt one particular community, whereas other communities that may have more privilege or more wealth can just ignore these narratives entirely, that could be cause for concern as to whether you want that narrative to rise or you want that narrative to be dominant um, in society. But also, I think one interesting facet to look at, and I apologize for the way in which my face is blocking the PowerPoint. I might be able to edit that actually. Just give me a second. Okay, I made the change. As I was saying, I think the other thing to point out is that how popular a narrative is can also determine how much control there is over the way in which the narrative is perpetuated. So a narrative that's more insular in nature, that is spread amongst less people, a religious narrative perhaps, could be very top down, right? Could be more easily controllable by the people at the very top who have power over their religious community or their religious organization, right? But there are also other narratives that are more democratized in nature, that as it spreads or as it rises, perhaps in some motions, the ability for that narrative to stay free of, moderating influence, um, becomes diminished in a sense. So, for instance, one example could be something like filial piety, right, in Asian countries. Nowadays, I think the way in which filial piety is accepted, within some communities is that you don't really have to be as rooted to your hometown as you used to be. Parents are more willing to send their children overseas, let them work overseas, for instance, without complaining about how they're not seeing the child all that often. So communication in a way has moved online in some places. The concept of being filial is also now in the form of remittances in some parts of the world as well. And all that means that as society has progressed, the ways in which filial piety has been construed within society also evolves as well, right? There are outside influences like the desire to be individualistic, right? As most young people now tend to be because of the way that social media has perpetuated the notion that individualism is good. All that has sort of tempered filial piety in a way. And so, if your opponent's running a perhaps a outdated or uncharitable characterization of um, a particular narrative, being able to correct that and go, that's not how that narrative has spread within society, um, is something that could potentially be debate winning in some rooms. And so the final thing I want to say about mechanization in general is that um, the more your narrative seems to be congruent to reality, the more likely it is that you'll be able to find reasons to support your characterization of the narrative, right? So being able to think about the ways in which that narrative operates on the ground, the ways in which it is transmitted, etc., gives you just a lot more believability when you're able to explain these things to a judge. And also just, as a side point, it's also just intellectually more honest, which too little people care about these days, and which you should absolutely care about moving forward. So let's move on to the second part then. The second win con, right? The idea of the uniquely valuable impact. I think what's interesting to note is that most narratives interact with other narratives in a meaningful way. Often narratives don't actually work in isolation. So to be able to say that a narrative is uniquely valuable is often something that requires a lot more proof than most teams give in a typical BP's round. There are narratives that augment other narratives. There are narratives that temper other narratives. So, for instance, as I was previously talking about, the individualistic narrative that's popular and prevalent amongst young people these days comes into some conflict with the idea of taking care of a family. They are emphasized in different spheres. The individualistic narrative is emphasized online, on media. The family narrative obviously is more insular in nature, but they do temper each other, right? So in some ways they moderate each other, right? And they moderate how dominant the other narrative can be within society, um, because they push back against one another. But there are other narratives that can potentially augment uh, different narratives as well. So, for instance, in Tokyo Ivy, there was a motion about cut-off culture, which is the narrative that when you fight with somebody, the best thing to do is just like cut them off, after it, like if it's a protracted fight or whatever, just move on with your life, block the number, whatever. And in some ways, this can be um uh like tempered, right, potentially, by other narratives about forgiveness, for example. But in other ways, it is augmented by narratives like, you should take care of yourself first, you should be individualistic, right? And therefore, like you shouldn't be willing to deal with somebody else's problems or take care of them, or like want to forgive them, and see their point of view. So in some ways, narratives that might be otherwise distinct can augment each other in because of the fact that narratives tend to be fairly interconnected. How do you weaponize this? I think the most important thing to note is that since narratives don't act alone, the impact of a specific or a singular narrative is very variable based on how it interacts with other narratives. So is the narrative that you're discussing secondary to a different narrative? Is it subservient to a different narrative? Or is it the cause of other narratives to begin with? Does it sprout up other narratives? Knowing these things are particularly important because what you want to be able to do, like in a typical B piece, for example, is if you're on the team that supports a particular narrative, you want to say that, without this narrative, there are other narratives that would not be as strong, that are also positive. So there's a sort of cascading effect in that sense. That's why you need that particular narrative around. You could also potentially say that the narrative, even if it's detrimental in large quantities. So like narratives that might seem like, if everybody does it, it'll be really, really, really bad, right? If everybody only follows this doctrine or this creed, like only look out for yourself, right? That could be really, really bad. It can potentially act as a moderating effect if the society at large right now is currently tilted against that narrative, right? So if society currently is extremely selfless, for example, I'm not saying it is, right? Then having one competing narrative, one moderating influence on this otherwise dominant culture could potentially be a good thing. So this is one or two ways in which you can exploit the relationship between narratives, as well as what the starting point for society is before the narrative, right? To be able to situate the narrative within this weave of interconnecting narratives. To be able to say, for example, if you're in opposition, we already have so many different narratives. This additional one is going to be harmful and it is unnecessary. It's not unique, right? And it's only going to add on to the already dominant narrative that we don't really like to be this dominant in society. And similarly, if you're on Gov, you might say we want this narrative because there are so many other forces acting against you as an individual already. This narrative could be one way to counteract the narrative. Of course, you still need to mechanize how, right, these narratives can potentially change or shape your outlook. So that goes back to the first part of like today's video. But ultimately, generally, what I've found is that you get a lot more success in winning narratives motions if you are able to point out where that narrative stands within that weave of interacting and interconnected narratives, and therefore you're able to show why a narrative is uniquely placed or uniquely situated to be able to do one thing vis-a-vis the other. And that's generally something that can be quite useful, right, in strategizing out a round during prep and how you want to approach, right, these rounds. Right, so I do acknowledge that this is obviously a fairly short video, and there might be things that you might still find to be quite unclear. I and I think if you have those questions or queries, my email is on the screen. I'll happily answer any questions that you might have, and give you more pointers along the way. I just don't want to have to do a 45-minute video that people tend to stop watching after 20 minutes anyway. So we are kind of at that 20-minute mark. Like I said, my email's there. And if you need anything, feel free to contact me using that link. All right. I will also share the slides with the AVP committee, so you should be able to receive these slides. And otherwise, have a great day. Cheers.